Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Homeowners Friend Podcast. I'm Steve, your host, and on today's show, we're going to take a look at wattage, how to calculate it, what's the difference between a watt and a kilowatt, and a watt and a watt hour and a kilowatt hour, how the power company calculates your electric bill, which of course is very important, and then you can use this information to kind of calculate the cost of various appliances in your home, how much they're going to cost to operate for a day, a week, a month, a year. And using that data, of course, you can figure out whether or not it's worth it for you to replace those appliances with something perhaps a little bit more efficient. So it's going to be an interesting show and a great lead up to our next show, which is going to be kind of a look at a hypothetical solar power system, which is going to kind of bring all the stuff we talked about together, because we're going to talk about a little bit about everything. And I think it'll be an interesting wrap up to this electrical series. And then, of course, we can start getting into actually some more hands-on stuff, which will be kind of fun. So with that, we'll get into the show. Oh, and don't forget to hit like below on the YouTube page here if that's where you're watching it. Of course, we have our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/home podcast. Go on there and I love it when folks go on there and post, a project you may have done. Or ask questions. Kind of get that page a little bit more active. I think it's a great resource for folks. Obviously, everybody watching the show is into home improvement, and obviously you've all got questions. That's why you're watching the show. So, why not go on Facebook and just post some questions, and you can answer each other's questions, or I can get out there and talk about different projects that you might be looking to accomplish. I think it's a great resource, and folks really aren't using it very much. So I invite you to go over there and check that out, and perhaps put a post out about a project that you're thinking of doing. So with that, we'll get into the show. Okay, so I got my little cheat sheet here of topics that I want to cover, so I don't get off into too many tangents. James Watt, who was born in 1736 and died in 1819, is the father of the watt, so to speak. And a watt is simply defined as a joule of electricity or energy for 1 second. A joule is defined as 1 amp through 1 ohm for 1 second. 1 amp, 1 ohm, 1 second. We're starting to get into a little bit of Ohm's law here. I'm not going to go there and bore you, but just to say that those are kind of the foundations of what a watt is. But the only thing that you need to know is that a watt is a momentary measurement of power, either consumption or generation. If you have a 5,000 watt generator and the thing's floored and beating its little heart out, it's going to be putting out 5,000 watts of energy when it's running, again, if at full bore, or something less than that if it's not at full bore. Of course, a 60 watt light bulb uses 60 watts of power whenever it's lit. That's kind of its instantaneous demand. That's how much power it needs and requires and uses. A 60 watt light bulb is going to use more power than a 20 watt light bulb. More watts means more energy being consumed. I think you probably all already realize that. But I'll ask you a question now, if you're so smart. What uses more power, a 1,500 watt heater, electric heater, or a 60 watt light bulb? Now, I know a lot of you jumped in your mind and said, well, of course, the heater. And you could be right, but I can show you how you can be wrong. Because we have to introduce a time element whenever we're talking about power and how much power we're using. In fact, time can be as important or even more important when figuring how much power something uses than the actual wattage rating of it. It's kind of like saying my car burned 5 gallons of gas last week. What does that mean? Is it efficient or is it not? You don't know unless you know how many miles I drove. If I used 5 gallons of gas and drove 50 miles, that's 10 miles per gallon. That's pretty crummy today. If I drove 500 miles, and that's a 100 miles per gallon car, that would be very efficient. But without knowing the mileage, you don't know. Perhaps it just all leaked out of the gas tank in my driveway and I never moved it an inch, in which case it would be both inefficient and quite damaging to the environment. So you have to know not only the amount of energy it's using, but over what time. So in electricity, we use the watt hour. It's basically 1 watt over 1 hour. So you can calculate that by just knowing the number of watts and multiply it by the number of hours that the thing functions. So if you had something that was, let's say, 100 watt hours, we'll just take a round number, 100 watt hours. A 100 watt light bulb running for 1 hour would use 100 watt hours. If you had a 200 watt light bulb and you ran it for a half an hour, you would use up 100 watt hours. You get it? It's 200 watts, but we only used it for a half an hour. So it's basically 200 times 0.5, which is 100 watt hours. If I had a 400 watt light bulb or 400 watt device, we're getting out of light bulbs, I think we're getting pretty big. But if I ran a 400 watt device for 15 minutes or 1/4 of an hour, that would also be equal to 100 watt hours. And, you know, taking that further, if I had a 1,000 watt device and ran it for 1/10 of an hour, or approximately 6 minutes, that would also be 100 watts per hour, 100 watt hours. And it goes the other ways too. It goes the other way as well. If the thing only used 50 watts and I ran it for 2 hours, that would be 100 watts. Or 10 watts. If it used 10 watts of power and I ran it for 10 hours, that would be 100 watts, watt hours of electricity, and so on. So you can see that it's not only how much it's drawn, but it's how long it's being drawn for, and you have to know both of those things to be able to calculate it. And since sometimes the number of watt hours, or watts even, get very large, 27,000 watts, we don't say 27,000 watts, we say 27 kilowatts. A K means 1,000 in metric. So your electric meter reads, or your electric bill, I should say, in your meter, read in kilowatt hours, or 1,000 watt hours, because otherwise the numbers would be so big it would be ridiculous. So they just kind of, you know, knock a few zeros off there and make it a little bit more of a reasonable number. Now, as I said, power is commercially measured using the kilowatt hour. The cost for a kilowatt hour of electricity in America runs from about 8 all the way to 37 cents, depending on where you live. In most areas of the country, geographically speaking, it's about 10 to 12 cents, give or take. In the Northeast, in Alaska, Hawaii, California, it's more expensive. And in some places like Idaho, it's down to 8.14 cents, quite a bit cheaper. I think 37 cents, if I remember right. I think that was Hawaii, but I may be mistaken. I think I got this off the federal government Department of Energy website. So to calculate, again, the power consumption of something, you just simply take the number of watts that it uses and you multiply it by the time it operates in hours. Now, alternatively, you can take and go the watts times the time in minutes, and then divide that result by 60, gives you the same amount. So if something runs for hours on end, you can just multiply it out. If something's going to only run for a few minutes, you can multiply it by the minutes and then just divide the answer by 60. So let's do a quick example so you can understand the watts and watt hours and kilowatt hours a little bit better. And we'll use a simple 60 watt light bulb. If you ran that light bulb for 1 hour, remembering the formula, it's watts, 60, times the number of hours equals 1. That would be 60 watt hours, okay? If you used it for 2 hours, it'd be 60 times 2, or 120 watt hours. Pretty straightforward. If you wanted to calculate this 120 watt hours into kilowatt hours, you would go 120 divided by 1,000, and it would give you 0.12 kilowatt hours, 0.12 kilowatt hours. If you wanted to calculate the cost of that, you would of course go 0.12 kilowatt hours times whatever the power cost in your neighborhood, and we'll use the national average. There goes my pen. The national average, which is 12 cents, and that would come out to 0.02 0.0144, or about 1.44 cents to operate that light bulb for 2 hours. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. And that's basically how you do it. And we got some more examples to show you to keep you, or give you some more experience here. Let's go back to my light bulb and heater example. This will be kind of fun. Let's say we have a 60-watt light bulb, and let's say we're going to run that light bulb for 5 hours per day. Say somebody gets home at 6 o'clock and they go to bed, or it gets dark at 6 o'clock and they go to bed at 11 or 5 to 10 or whatever. 5 hours a night. It's probably a pretty good average for how much you would use a light bulb. And of course, you're going to use that every day of the week and every day of the year. So it would be 60 watts, 5 hours per day, 365 days per year. If we multiply that out, 60 watts times 5, we would get 300 watts per day, right? Multiply that out by 365 days in a year, we come out with 109,500 watts. And you can do the math. 109,500 watts divided by 1,000 to get the kilowatt, because again, we're getting the big numbers here, equals 109.5 kilowatt hours. If we multiply that by, again, the national average of 0.12 cents per kilowatt hour, we come out with a cost of $13.14 to run the bulb for that amount of time. Now, let's go to the heater example. The heater is 1,500 watts. But this gentleman's only going to use the heater for about a third of an hour, or about 20 minutes each day while he takes a shower, because his bathroom's cold. Old crappy farmhouse with no insulation. So 0.3 hours per day. And let's say he's in a rather temperate climate, so in the summertime he doesn't need to use it. So he only uses it for half the year. So 1,500 watts times 0.3 hours per day times 180 days equals 81,000 watt hours per year. 81,000 watt hours is how many kilowatts? 81. 81 kilowatt hours. We multiply that by 0.12, and we come out with 972, which is clearly less than $13. So you can't really say that the heater is going to use more electricity than the light bulb. It's true, when it's operating, the heater uses more electricity, but if you don't use it that much, it doesn't really matter. It depends on how much you're going to be using these things. We could do a couple other ones real quick. Let me just erase this stuff. Okay, let's look at another example. Something that uses a little bit of power, but it's on a lot. For example, a clock radio, or perhaps a little night light that you just leave on all the time in a dark bathroom or something like that. Let's say that clock radio uses 1 watt of power as it's just sitting there displaying the time. That's probably about right, and probably even when the radio's on, it's probably not much more than that. You're going to obviously use or leave that clock radio on 24 hours a day, and you're obviously going to leave that on 365 days a year. It's on constantly. If you multiply those out, it comes out to 8,760 watt hours. Just do the math. 1 times 24 times 365 is 8,760 watts, which of course is 8.76 kilowatt hours. And if you multiply that by 0.12, you're going to come out with about $1.05 per year to operate that clock radio. Pretty insignificant. I mean, that's for 12 months. So it's like a dime a month or something, not even. Here's another example. Okay, let's say you have a small hunting camp, and you want to be able to keep a little bit of heat in that, especially when you go up there to use it. Or maybe it's a vacation camp if you don't hunt, whatever. Place to go writing, reading, whatever you want to call it. It could be your workshop out in the backyard. I don't know. And let's say you want to just put a little bit of heat in it, but you know, electricity is the most expensive thing to heat with, right? You've been told that, and it's true. I mean, it is. But it depends how much you're going to use it. Now, let's say you went and got, a price to have some kind of a propane furnace put in that, or some kind of an oil furnace, just a small camp. And, they came back with costs of, thousands of dollars. You need chimneys or direct vents, the equipment, the fuel supply. And it's going to cost you thousands of dollars to install this, which I think would be probably pretty reasonable unless you could find a used furnace somewhere. But let's just say, would it make sense? Plus, you got the maintenance thing, don't forget. With the furnace, sometimes they don't work. They might stop working and you're not there. Let's say it's a camp up in, northern Vermont or northern Wisconsin, and you don't live near there or something, and you only go up there occasionally. So there's the maintenance thing if the thing breaks. So let's just say you want to try, let's just see about using some electric heat to keep this thing warm. How much would it really cost? An 8-foot standard electric heater like you'd find in the house, the permanently mounted ones, use around 2,000 watts. I looked on Grainger's catalog, and they had some there that were 2,000. I think there's some that were like 2,500, but let's just say you got a 2,000 watt one. And that's good for around 300 square feet to heat, which is a pretty big space. I mean, you're talking a 15 by 20 space. That's a pretty good sized camp, assuming you've got a little bit of insulation in it anyway. You should be able to at least keep the chill off. Let's say where it is, let's say it's not in the Arctic. Let's say it's cold in that area for like, 3 months, 4 months out of the year, okay, for about a quarter of the year. And let's say that heater needs to run 8 hours per day, each day, to keep the thing up at the certain temperature that you want it to be. So how can we calculate how much that's going to cost? Well, it's pretty simple, right? We got 2,000 times the number of hours per day times the number of days in a year that you're going to operate, which we say about 4 months would be about 120 days. And if you calculate that out, it comes to 1,920 kilowatt hours. I'm not even going to tell you what the watts are. Obviously, it's quite a bit more than that. And if you multiply that by 0.12 cents, if assuming you're in an area with fairly reasonable electricity, it's going to cost you about $230 a year in electricity to heat that cabin with electricity. Not an insignificant amount, but not a ridiculous amount either, considering the heater costs $50. You can buy one at, you can probably buy them at Home Depot, Lowe's, Grainger, any number of places. You can install it yourself. You just need to run a lot of these things run off 220, so the current is pretty minimal. 2,000 watts at 220 is not a lot of current. So you just probably run a piece of, 12.3 to it or something like that, or maybe even 14.3. Would probably be adequate, and costs you nothing to put the thing in. You don't have to do the maintenance. The power company does the maintenance, right? If the power goes out, they come and fix it. So you don't have, there's, electric heaters, they never break. I mean, unless the thermostat goes bad or something, I mean, they basically never break. So, you can heat your camp for $230 a year. It's not horrible, for a year to not have to worry about it. So maybe something like that would work. This is a good example of how you can use these calculations to kind of figure out if something makes sense. If it's going to cost you $1,000 to put a system in, then you still have to buy the fuel for it. Maybe it doesn't matter. However, if you were living in this place and you were running this thing 24 hours a day, and you were in a climate where it was colder, you might be getting to 500 or again, this is for one heater in one room. So if you had, 5 rooms and you were running it more hours per day because you wanted to keep the temperature higher, it could get up to $1,000 easy. And then we get to that point, you're like, maybe we should get something different, an oil burner, a wood stove, a propane. maybe this heater, you just leave it set at like 45 degrees just to keep things from freezing in the cupboards. And then when you get there, you light off the wood stove or whatever. It's an option. I'm just showing that these are the kind of calculations you can do for these kinds of instances. Let's say you had the same camp and it was $230 a year to heat it. Let's say you had 3 bulbs also that you ran, one inside and one on the front porch and one on the back, door or whatever. And let's say they were CFL, so they're 13 watts each. So we had 3 13-watt light bulbs, and let's say you ran them 12 hours a day for security purposes. How much would that cost a year? Well, 13 times 3 times 12 is 365, or times 365, excuse me, days, right, is about 170 kilowatt hours. So you're about another $20.50 a year to run those lights all the time. You can't quite see that, I'm in the way. So that's not bad. So, between the two things, you can have the place lit for security and heated basically for $250 a year. These are the kind of calculations you can do. Now, 12 cents a kilowatt hour is pretty cheap for power. Where you live, it may be a lot more expensive, and you really got to check that. And the other thing, I'll talk to you a little bit later about calculating the cost of power, but it's on your electric bill, it's not only the cost of the power. In a lot of areas, there's a generation charge, which is actually the cost of the power, but there may also be a transmission charge or other charges that are on the mill. So you need to look and kind of figure that out completely. And one thing I did here in Connecticut a while back is I actually divided the number of kilowatt hours by the entire bill. That was taxes and all the fees and everything else. And it was, I forget what I came out with, and I probably should have did it again for the show, but I think it was like up around 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So again, New England is very, very expensive, but other areas it's less expensive. So just some more examples. Let's look at an electric hot water heater, because that's a killer. Now, home hot water heater, they can use about 5,500 watts of power when that little element's on, or big element's on, when it's heating the water. And it runs, this again is according to the government website, I think it was the Energy Star website or one of those, that they run about 2.5 hours per day on average to heat the water back up again for what you're using. So if we do 5.5 kilowatt hours, and I'm starting with kilowatt hours here, so I'm going to end with kilowatt hours, times 2.5 hours per day times 365 days a year, not counting, when you're on vacation or whatever. Let's just say it's on every day of the year. The cost to run that's about $602, which works out to about $50 a month, which incidentally is about the average cost to heat hot water or electric hot water heater each month. $600 a year is a fairly significant amount of money, and frankly, it's if you have an electric hot water heater, the electric hot water heater itself is probably going to be about a third usually a third to a half of your power bill. It's just your hot water heater. So getting rid of that thing and using a gas hot water heater or something could save you a lot of money. So I just wanted to show you that because it's such a huge demand of power, and because we do use them, it functions for several hours a day. And of course, if you got a couple of teenagers in the room in the house, you could probably double this number. So you can see that it adds up really quick. We've talked a lot about how to calculate wattage in its various forms. But what happens if you want to actually measure it? If you don't know how much something's using and you want to be able to measure it, there's several ways to do that. Everybody's got a watt meter on the side of their house, and you can use that. Another method would be to use an amp meter. Another method might be to use a small commercial portable watt meter like a kilowatt meter. And we'll talk about all three of these in this segment. Let's start though with the meter on the side of your house. If you have commercial power, you've got a meter on the side of your house. That's pretty much a given. So everybody has one of these, unless you're on solar or something. Everybody has one of these, so it's certainly an option that everybody can use. there's two different things you can get, or bits of information you can get from this. First of all, you can find out how much power you've used over a given time. So for example, you want to know how much power you're using per day. You can take a reading at 8 o'clock in the morning today and another reading at 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. You can subtract the first from the second, and it'll tell you how many kilowatt hours you've used. And that's pretty straightforward. And the other thing you can do is actually use this meter to calculate the power usage of a particular device or a series of devices individually, kind of a snapshot, at a particular time. Like for example, you wanted to know how much power does my water heater use when it's operating. You can use this to calculate that, and we'll show you how to do both of those things now. So let me zoom in on this so you can get a good look at the dials and all that, and we can explain it. Okay, so this is a picture of an old-fashioned watt meter, and it was taken by user John Wilson, 1969, and placed on Flickr. And it's I thank him for that. It's Creative Commons commercial use, so we can use it here on the show. I would have taken a picture of one, but mine's digital now, and I don't even know where I could find an analog one. They've all been swapped out around here to digital. So thanks to him for putting this out there. But this is just a pretty typical watt meter, same kind of thing we had on the side of our house for years. A couple things that I'll point out. You've got your little dial gauges here. These indicate the number of kilowatts that this meter has read. So basically, it's for the service of this house. This is how many kilowatts that it's read, and we'll talk about that more in a second. This is your little turning disc that indicates that power is flowing through the meter, and you can also use that to calculate your instantaneous demand, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the other thing I'll point out is this KH7.2. That's a number that you need to do that instantaneous calculation, which I'll show you in a minute, but I just wanted to point it out while we have this up on the screen. So they all say that. Usually 7.2 is the number you're going to see, but it could be something different. So you just need to find that. These are just serial numbers and whatnot for the power company. Nothing we need to be concerned with. So these 5 dial gauges or readouts are, again, how much power has passed through this meter since it was hooked up. Now, and of course it's analog, so it could have gone around like an old car odometer. Could have gone around a few times. You never know how long it's been up there, but how much power has gone through it. But nonetheless, this is going to be your you always start it just like the way you read normal numbers. The one on the right is going to be your ones and your tens, your hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, etc. So of course the one on the left is going to turn extremely slowly. Maybe it might only turn once over a whole year or something, depending on how much power you use. But the one on the right should move. You're probably not going to watch it move unless you're really using a lot of power. But certainly over the course of a day, it should certainly move quite a bit. This, of course, is your disc, and that spins as power moves through the meter. So how to read this thing? There's another little tidbit with these, is that the first one is turning to the right. You'll see the numbers go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the right. This one here is the opposite. It turns to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you got to remember that. This one turns to the right, to the left, and to the right. It's just the way they're geared, I guess. Just not a big deal. You just need to realize that, because it can throw you for a loop. So basically, the convention for reading these things is to just round every number up to the next number. So this dials between the 6 and the 7, so we would call it a 7. This dials between the 3 and the 4, so we would call it a 4. Between 7 and 8, we would call it an 8. Between 3 and 4, we'd call it a 4. And 8 and 9, we would call it a 9. If a number is right on top of a number, you can't really tell if it's before. Like if it's, like in this case, this is pretty close to 4, although you can tell it's a little bit, well, no, it's actually a little bit before 4. There's 3 and there's 4. It's a little bit before 4. But even if it was a little bit closer and you couldn't tell, you can always go to the meter to the right, because of course, each time this turns one turn, this moves one number here. So if this is somewhere near a 7 or 8 or 9 like this one is, that means it hasn't hit the next number yet. So it's going to be a little bit shy of 4, so you would round it up to 4. If this meter, however, was anywhere past the 0, in other words, a half or 1, then you would know it went past the 4, and then you would call it a 5. So that's how you can tell if it's right on the number. Just look to the one to the right. If it's before the 0, an 8 or a 9, round down to that lower number. If it's after the 0, 1 or 2 or what have you, just round up. But that's basically how you read these things. Pretty straightforward. Write your number down, and then the next time you come write the number down again, remembering to round up in the same method. Subtract your first one from your second one, and that'll tell you the number of kilowatt hours that you've used. Okay, so let's say you have an analog meter and you want to be able to calculate how much a particular device is using at an instant or at a time. That's what's its power consumption for that one device. Let's say it's your water heater, since we were just talking about water heaters. So you turn off all your breakers in your house except for your water heater. Make sure your water heater is heating water. Like, do this after you take a bath or a shower or something. And go out to your meter. And of course, your meter is going to have that little spinny disc thing, which you always see, and the numbers are, going to be on the top. The spinning disc is going to have a little black mark on it. So you want to first of all find out how many seconds it takes for that disc to go around one turn, and you want to write that down. And the second thing you want to write down is they call the KH number. If you look, there's usually a bunch of numbers on the bottom, and somewhere it'll say KH and then a number. And generally you're going to see 7.2. That seems to be what most residential ones are. So then you plug it into the following formula: 3600 times that KH number, which is 7.2, divided by the time in seconds it takes for one turn. So let's just say it takes a minute for the thing to turn one loop around. So it'd be 3600 times 7.2 divided by 60 seconds. And if you do that math, it comes out to 432. So that device, whatever it is, would be using 432 watts. Let's say it did it in 10 seconds. If it did it in 10 seconds and you did the math, it would be using 2,592 watts. So it's pretty straightforward, but I'll show you a much easier way to do this. So in our water heater example, it would probably take around 5 seconds for that thing to go around once. I think it's going to be really humming. And probably you're going to see similar responses when you're looking at a big air conditioner or something like that. Digital meters are really simple. They just kind of keep flashing through different numbers. They're going to tell you the quantity used, like the old dials would give you, and perhaps some other stuff. So you can just read it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, another way to measure the power consumption of a particular device or appliance, besides going outside and using your meter, which you certainly can do, and it's certainly accurate, but it's kind of a pain because it's outside and you got to shut everything else off in the house, is to just measure that particular device itself inside the home using one of two methods. And I'm sure there's others, but these are the two that I'm going to talk about. One of which is to use a amp meter to measure the current that the device is drawing. Now, if you remember from our Ohm's law discussion, the formula P equals E times I, or power equals voltage times current. So if you know the voltage that something's operating at, which is pretty much universally in your house going to be 120 volts, unless it's like a water heater, then it'll be 240. But most of the time it's going to be 120. And if you can find the current using one of these guys, you can calculate the power. So if it's drawing 2 amps, for example, you would be looking at a 240 watt appliance. It's pretty straightforward. 5 amps would be a 600 watt appliance or what have you. Now, these meters are very cool, these particular amp meters, because they have this clamp. And all you have to do is clamp it over one of the cables feeding a device. Now, if you had a cord like this one, both cables are within one cord essentially. So you can't just clamp over that with this device. It won't work. You have to get only one of the power carrying conductors, either the hot or the neutral in this case. So, short of taking this cable apart or splitting it or something, which you could do, I guess you could take a razor blade and just, slice in the groove there and just pull it apart, and it really wouldn't hurt the cord, but it does knock the integrity to some extent. You can purchase one of these devices here, which this particular one is by Sears. They're like $10. And actually what it is it's got a plug on one end where you plug your device in that you're measuring, and it's got a plug on the other end that you plug into the to the wall outlet. And then there's these two holes, and you just take your meter and you clamp it over one or the other hole. And there's two holes because one of them is times 1. I'm holding this upside down, but one of them is times 1 and one of them is times 10. So if you have it over the times 1 one and it's reading 1 amp, then you have actually 1 amp flowing through the circuit. If it was reading 1 amp on the times 10 range, then it's actually 1/10 of an amp in real, real current consumption. It actually multiplies it by 10. And that's kind of handy if you're looking at something that draws a little teeny bit of power, like let's say a clock radio or an LED light or something like that. That's a very small demand. By having the times 10, you're going to get a little bit more of a field there, and this meter is going to be able to pick it up a little bit better, and probably it's going to be more accurate, although I don't know if that really has an effect on it, but it's just an option. So that's a good way of measuring it. These meters here, you can buy these at Home Depot, at Lowe's, at a lot of hardware stores. You certainly can get them online, Amazon.com or what have you. This is a Klein. Milwaukee makes them. Fluke makes the best meters. Excuse me. Fluke makes the best meters that are out there, I think. They're a little bit more expensive, but this one here works pretty good. And I did test its accuracy against the second device I'm going to show you, and they were pretty much neck and neck within a little bit. So I believe it's pretty accurate. So instead of actually measuring the current, another cool device is that you can buy, and they're like 18 bucks on Amazon, and they sell them at a lot of stores. This little device called a kilowatt. It's a kilowatt meter, and it's kill, like you use this to save energy is what I guess their point. Find energy hogs in your house, like kilowatt. This is the Easy. It's a P4460 is the model. If you go on Amazon, this one will pop up, and then they have another one that has a timer that's more expensive. I think it's kind of overkill. I think this is really all you need, and it's like 18 bucks. And there's another brand, I don't remember what it is. There's another brand that does some more measuring, instantaneous readings for surge currents and stuff like that. Don't think you really need it, and I think it can actually log to a computer and stuff like that. But for the average homeowner, I don't think you need it. This for 18 bucks is really all you need. And simply plug this bad boy into the wall and plug your device into it. You program into this the cost of your electricity. Like in my case, like 20 cents a kilowatt for the power here in Connecticut, which is ridiculous between the generation and delivery charges. And you reset the thing. If it's new, you won't have to, but each time you use it, you'll reset it. And you just let it sit there. And you can go through and the menu, and you can hit the up and down buttons, and you can actually see the voltage of the circuit. You can see the current the circuit's drawing, and you can also see the power that the device is using instantaneous. And as you let it sit there, it's accumulating the power consumption. So like for a refrigerator, if you left it going for 24 hours exactly and came back, it would tell you how many kilowatt hours that device used in total for a whole day. Obviously, refrigerator is turning on and off. You have the light and different things, so it's using different amounts of power at different times of the day, depending on whether or not it's actually, the compressor's running or whatever. So this will give you kind of an average. It'll give you the exact consumption for that day, and then you can extrapolate that out over a year, and you can calculate how much the thing costs per year. And it also tell you how much it costs to run it for that day by automatically multiplying your cost factor that you put into it. And I think it'll do it for like a day, a month, a year or something. There's some different options. But really, really cool and very simple. Very simple to do, and it's great for devices, again, that a light bulb's pretty easy to calculate, right? You just need to know how many hours it runs and the wattage. But the refrigerator, you don't really know how much it draws, and you don't really know how often it runs. This is great for a refrigerator. It's great for, I had it hooked up to my little dehumidifier. I found out that was costing me a few bucks each month to run. Anything like that, it's really cool. You can even hook up to your Keurig coffee maker and see how much it costs, in an average week just to run your coffee maker. You can hook it up to your TV set. What's your TV set, draw for power when you're watching TV? What's it draw for power when it's sitting idle? And the idle current on these things is really low these days. They've really improved that, so that uses less electricity when it sits there. It's part of the Energy Star rating. So these are really cool, and I recommend getting one. Downsides to these, you can't really measure something that doesn't have a plug on it unless you put a plug on it. For example, your furnace. Furnace is directly hardwired, and it's only 120 volts. It doesn't do 220. So you can't measure things like your electric stove. You can't measure, air conditioning systems, things like that. Furnace, which is directly hardwired, hot water heater certainly. Can't measure anything like that. So for those large devices, I think the clamp meter in our previous explanation is going to be your best bet. Just just calculate it out and estimate the number of hours or whatever that it operates, and you can get a pretty good idea that way. But definitely a cool device, inexpensive, and I highly recommend getting one. So last thing we'll do is we'll kind of go through a couple of quick exercises using the kilowatt meter and the clamp amp meter. And the first thing I did is, as I mentioned earlier, I used it with my Keurig coffee maker. And if you don't have a Keurig coffee maker, you probably don't know how the thing works, but you basically turn it on and it heats the water up. And it takes about a minute to a minute and maybe a quarter. It's really quick to heat up the water to make your first cup of coffee. When you hit the dispense button, there's some little pumps and compressors and things that run in it that push the water out through. But that uses very little power. The power is used mainly when you're heating the water up, and it's for a very short time. So I just did, with these 2 meters, I did a little experiment, and I'll show you some pictures. On the kilowatt meter, it read 11.36 amps when I went into that mode of the meter, and the Klein clamp meter read 11.56 amps. 0.2 amps when you're talking 11. That's not bad. That's pretty accurate. If you take the Klein and multiply that by 115 volts, which is about what I was reading, 115, 116 when I did the test, it comes out with 1,329 watts of consumption when the thing's heating water, which again is most of the power that it uses. The kilowatt meter read 1,300 watts when I went into that function. So, again, they're pretty close. They're pretty close, within a couple of percent. And actually, the kilowatt meter is advertised as being accurate within 2%. So, 2% of 1,300 watts is 26 watts. So it's pretty close. It's about right there. I don't know exactly how accurate the Klein is either. Neither of them are perfect. So they both came in pretty close. Now, the kilowatt meter, after making a cup of coffee and then letting it heat back up again to make a second cup of coffee, read 0.03 kilowatt hours consumed, 0.3 of a kilowatt hour. If I multiply that out times our power, it was like $0.002 or 0.2 of a cent. So it's you'd have to make about 5 cups of coffee before you'd run your power bill up a penny. So that was kind of a neat little thing. I checked my furnace. Now I have an American Standard. It's one of the new high efficiency gas or propane furnaces. It's got the variable speed fan on it. When it was running, it drew about 3.6 amps. Now again, that's when the furnace fan is blowing too. Obviously, if just the burners were on when it was preheating, it was a whole lot less than that. So 3.63 amps at 120 volts is about 400 watts. That's for the furnace. So not a lot of power. Something that could be run if it needed to by an inverter and a battery or something. I mean, it's not really a lot of power. Toaster. While I was in the kitchen, I did a couple more experiments. That drew about 6.8 amps. And it took about, again, about 0.02 kilowatts to toast a piece of bread, which is about 0.2 cents. Again, if you calculate that out. Now our microwave is interesting because it's a Panasonic inverter microwave, and it's supposed to draw, according to the label inside, it's supposed to draw a maximum of 12.7 amps. If you multiply that by 120, it's 1,524 watts. Well, I hooked a kilowatt up to it. It was actually reading 1,800 watts and flashing, because it's 15 amps is the max it can read. So it's probably reading more than that. So I don't know if there's something wrong with the microwave or if the label's incorrect or what, but something's not jiving there. But let's just use the numbers that they give us for Ha-Ha's, and let's measure, or let's calculate how much it would cost for you to warm up, you know, leftover dinner, a pot roast or something. Let's say you got to run it in the microwave for 5 minutes. Now, 5 minutes in a 1200 watt microwave is going to pretty much heat up anything pretty good. So that's a pretty good number. So 1524 watts times 5 minutes divided by 60, because I'm using minutes, I need to divide by 60, right? I'm not using hours to get the watt hour rating, equals 127 watts. Okay? And if I divide 127 by 1,000 to get the kilowatt rating, because that's how you measure the power in your home, it's 127 divided by 1,000 equals 0.12 kilowatt hours. And if I multiply that by 12 cents a kilowatt for your average cost of power, you're at about 1.5 cents. That's a 5. 1.5 cents to heat up your meal. So let's just keep that in mind. And let's do it a different way. Let's say you're going to use your oven to do the same thing. Let's say your oven has a 2,000 watt heating element in it, which is probably not too far from being what it is. So 2,000 watt element. It takes 10 minutes just to warm the oven up. And let's say it takes another 20 to warm the food up. These are not unreasonable numbers. So it could take a half an hour to heat that food up. So 2,000 watts times 30 minutes divided by 60 should be, you can do the math here in your head, it's 1 kilowatt hour of power, which isn't a lot, but it's certainly more than what the microwave did. So 1 kilowatt, in my case, times 20 cents a kilowatt, it's going to cost 20 cents to heat that food up in the oven. And if it only takes half the time, 15 minutes, it's 10 cents. It's still a lot more than a penny and a half. So microwaves are really, really efficient. And it's like one of these compact fluorescent light bulbs. It's giving you the light, or in the case of the microwave, the heat in the food. It's warming the food up, but it's not warming the air up. It's not warming up the appliance. When you turn your oven on, you've got to warm the appliance up, the air up, and then the air in return warms the food up. With the microwave, you're just sending the microwave energy into the food, and that's what's heating it up. And it's not really heating up the air of the oven at all itself. I mean, it does warm up after a while because the food gets hot within the oven, and that heats it up. But it's a lot more efficient. So that's kind of cool to know. So hopefully you've enjoyed the show and learned how to calculate power and watt hours and kilowatt hours and all that, and hopefully you'll run out hopefully and buy one of these kilowatt meters. I think that'll be a really cool tool for you to have in your toolbox. Metaphorically speaking, I don't think you'd actually keep that in your toolbox, but keep it in your drawer or wherever. And when you want to figure out how much something uses for power, you pull that bad boy out, and it's a really cool tool for that use. And by knowing this stuff, hopefully you'll be able to save some money by maybe swapping out that old refrigerator for a more modern one. And you can save a lot of money over several years by doing that. So with that, again, feel free to go on the Facebook page. This would be a cool thing. If you get one of these meters, put some of your results on the Facebook page. Let people know how much different appliances use for power. Your refrigerator, your microwave, your whatever, popcorn maker. Put those things out there, and then people can look at those, and even if they don't have a kilowatt hour meter, they can get those readings for their own use, or they can compare them with their readings, and maybe you get a discussion go about ways to do things more energy efficient, do things that are more energy efficient, using different kinds of appliances or different methods, like say using the oven or using the microwave, that kind of thing. I mean, I think this could be a really cool discussion on Facebook. So maybe in the show notes under this show, start that little discussion. I think it'll be kind of fun. So with that, I'm going to sign with you. Thanks for watching the show, and take care, folks.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.